My name is Abigail Martin. I'm 32 years old, and the message that changed everything arrived on an ordinary afternoon in my Vermont farmhouse. It was short, polite, and devastating. My mother asking me to stay home for Thanksgiving because they needed space. In those few seconds, the air in the kitchen seemed to tighten around me. The scent of apples I'd been slicing for a pie lingered in the air, but my chest felt hollow. I had been the daughter who never missed a family holiday, the one who held traditions together like stitches in a well-worn quilt. And now, with one text, I was quietly removed from the picture. Before I take you into the heart of what happened next, and how that message changed everything, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. I read every single one, and it truly means the world to hear from you. May you have a blessed and peaceful day. I stood in my kitchen, holding the phone in one hand, a paring knife in the other, wondering how 32 years of loyalty could be dismissed so easily. The farmhouse around me was filled with the quiet I had once cherished. Outside the windows, the bare apple trees stood against a November sky, their twisted branches tracing a map of another season's end. I could still remember the years when Thanksgiving meant bustling warmth, overlapping voices, and the weight of responsibility balanced with a sense of belonging. It had been the one day a year when everyone set aside differences, and I believed that consistency was unshakable. This message told me otherwise. For most of my life in suburban Connecticut, I was the reliable daughter. I didn't rebel, I didn't disappear into teenage recklessness, and I didn't break the traditions that defined our family. I earned perfect grades, helped with every gathering, and never failed to show up when my parents needed me. My brother lived close, followed the expected path, and built a life that mirrored theirs. I had chosen differently, a career in kitchens instead of offices, the hum of stoves instead of boardrooms, and while they hadn't liked it, I thought they had learned to accept it. When I moved to Vermont, the rhythm between us began to shift. The distance made visits less frequent, calls shorter, and my life felt fuller in ways they didn't seem to understand. I had bought this old farmhouse on 5 acres, with a kitchen that felt like an extension of who I was. I imagined filling it with friends, neighbors, and family, my family, around a table I had chosen, in a home I had built. I believed they would see it as an invitation, a natural extension of our tradition. The text suggested otherwise. At first, I tried to soften the blow in my mind. Maybe they didn't feel well. Maybe the gathering would be smaller than usual. Maybe they were thinking of my long drive. But deep down, I knew. The gathering wouldn't be smaller. It would just be without me. That truth sat heavy in my chest, heavier than the knife I set down on the counter. I walked through the kitchen, past the long farm table I'd found in an antique store, the one I'd dreamed of setting for holidays. I thought of every mile I'd driven in past years, the hours spent preparing dishes to please them, the quiet ways I'd tried to earn their approval. I had folded myself into their expectations for so long that I almost didn't know who I was outside of them. But anger came, slow and steady, pushing back against the ache. It reminded me of the imbalance, the unspoken favoritism, and the years of giving without asking for anything in return. It reminded me that if my presence could be erased so quickly, maybe it was time to claim a different place for myself. I took out a notepad and drew a line down the center. On one side, I listed what was lost: the familiar drive, the sense of continuity, the belief that effort guaranteed belonging. On the other, I listed what was possible: a table truly mine, a gathering without tension, a holiday shaped by gratitude instead of performance. The second column began to grow. The image formed quickly: friends from nearby towns, neighbors who had welcomed me without judgment, colleagues who understood the joy of shared work in a kitchen. A Thanksgiving where every person at the table wanted to be there, not because tradition demanded it, but because warmth and connection drew them in. The thought lifted me. The heaviness in my chest loosened as I realized I didn't have to measure the holiday by their table. I could set my own. I could craft a day that was abundant, joyful, and mine in every sense. That afternoon, I began clearing the dining room. The long table moved into place, extra chairs brought in from the porch. I ran my hands over the smooth wood, imagining plates and candles, mismatched but beautiful. I could almost hear the laughter, the low hum of conversation, the clink of glasses. For the first time since the message arrived, I felt the warmth I had been craving, not from them, but from the possibility of what I could create. By the time evening fell, I had a plan. This year, I would not be the daughter left out. I would be the host who built something new. Growing up in suburban Connecticut, tradition was the anchor around which my entire sense of belonging formed. The walls of our home seemed to absorb the rhythm of family rituals. The Sunday dinners, the holiday baking sessions, the birthdays where every detail was orchestrated with precision. Thanksgiving sat at the heart of it all. It wasn't simply a meal. It was the day the Martin family put aside their everyday frictions and wove something that resembled unity. Or at least, that's how I wanted to remember it. I was the dependable daughter, the one who could be counted on to fill any gap, to arrive early and stay late, to smile through small tensions so the evening could feel seamless. My mother, Eleanor, took pride in her ability to host, but over time, she began to delegate. First, I was peeling vegetables while she chatted with guests. Then, I was handling the desserts while she set the table. Eventually, I was cooking most of the main dishes while she passed the torch, though she never fully stepped back from commentary. I told myself it was a mark of trust, that my skill in the kitchen was something she respected, even if her compliments were often wrapped in corrections. My father, James, was quieter but no less invested in the appearance of tradition. For him, the success of a holiday was measured in how smoothly it played out. No awkward silences, no public disagreements, no evidence of strain. It was an unspoken rule that we all played our parts, and mine was to be the steady one. My brother, David, could be late, could forget an ingredient, could skip an event entirely, but I was expected to hold the line. From the time I was a child, I understood the power of presentation in our family. The dining room had to look like something from a lifestyle magazine. Candles placed at precise intervals, silver polished until it caught the light just so, serving dishes matching the menu in both function and aesthetic. I absorbed these standards without question, learning to mirror them in my own spaces. I thought of it as care, a way of showing love. Only later would I realize it was also a performance. As I grew older, my own dreams began to take shape. By 10, I knew I wanted to be a chef. The kitchen was my sanctuary, a place where time moved differently and where I could create something tangible from nothing but raw ingredients. My parents didn't share the vision. To them, cooking was a pleasant skill but not a serious path. They imagined me in business attire, not chef's whites. Still, I held my ground. I went to culinary school, worked in kitchens that demanded everything I had, and eventually built a career that was mine entirely. Even as my life in New York grew more demanding, I made the drive home for Thanksgiving every year. I'd leave after a late shift, arriving in the early hours of Thursday morning with pies balanced on the passenger seat, my clothes carrying the scent of butter and rosemary from the night before. No matter how tired I was, I showed up. I thought that was what family meant, that you kept showing up no matter what. When I finally bought the farmhouse in Vermont, it felt like a dream realized. The kitchen alone could have been lifted from my imagination. Wide counters, deep farmhouse sink, windows that filled the room with light. It was the kind of space made for gathering people, for cooking with the freedom of not measuring every move against someone else's approval. I imagined hosting my family there, creating new traditions that still honored the old. But my move added hours to every visit. The casual Sunday dinners became rare. The daily phone calls turned into every other day, then once or twice a week. My parents noticed the shift, and though they never said it outright, they resented it. The warmth between us began to cool in small, almost invisible ways. Comments about how nice it was to have David just around the corner. Reminders of how much they valued having family close. At the time, I didn't see those moments for what they were. Subtle lines being drawn, a quiet repositioning of my place in the family dynamic. I told myself it was natural for relationships to change with distance. I thought the foundation we had built was too strong to fracture over a few less frequent visits. I underestimated how quickly tradition can become a tool for keeping someone in a certain role. In our family, tradition wasn't simply a backdrop, it was the measure of loyalty. To break from it, even slightly, was seen as a threat. I didn't realize that by building my own life, by putting down roots in a place they hadn't chosen for me, I was already stepping outside of their script. My absence at a few Sunday dinners wasn't just a scheduling issue. It was a challenge to the unspoken rule that my life would always bend to theirs. That's why the message about needing space landed with such force. It wasn't just an invitation withheld, it was a quiet declaration that I had stepped too far outside their comfort. It was a reminder that tradition, in our family, only worked when everyone agreed to the same terms. And those terms were rarely up for negotiation. In that moment, the weight of all those years pressed down on me. Every polished fork, every carefully plated dish, every long drive in the dark felt like proof that I had upheld my end of the tradition. The text told me none of that mattered now. What mattered was proximity, compliance, and a version of togetherness that required me to fit into a role I was no longer willing to shrink myself to fill. As I stood in my kitchen replaying the years that had led to this point, I realized something important. Tradition could be beautiful, but only when it was mutual. Only when it allowed everyone at the table to bring their whole selves without fear of being pushed aside. And for the first time in my life, I began to imagine what it would mean to create a tradition of my own. Looking back, the first signs were so small I could almost convince myself they weren't there. They came as pauses in conversations, as subtle changes in tone, as comments that landed heavier than they should have. At the time, I brushed them aside. I told myself, families have seasons, times when connection feels effortless, and times when it requires more work. I didn't realize these moments were the beginning of a slow shift that would pull me to the edge of the circle I had once been at the center of. The earliest fracture came not in an argument, but in absence. The first Sunday dinner I missed after moving to Vermont was for a reason that, to me, felt entirely reasonable. A heavy rainstorm had flooded my basement overnight, and I spent the day hauling out boxes, running the pump, and trying to save the flooring. By the time the water was under control, I was exhausted, covered in mud, and in no state to drive 3 hours each way. I called my parents to explain, expecting understanding. Instead, I was met with a silence that felt colder than the water I'd been standing in. When I finally saw them the following week, my mother's smile was polite, but there was an unmistakable coolness beneath it. She made a passing remark about how David and Pamela still managed to come by even with the baby, as if proximity alone should have erased my circumstances. It was the first time I felt that my reasons didn't matter. Only my absence did. From then on, the small gaps began to widen. I noticed how family stories were told with me just slightly on the outside, my name mentioned less often, my contributions to gatherings absorbed into the larger narrative without acknowledgement. I still brought dishes, still decorated, still tried to carry the weight of tradition, but it began to feel like I was performing in a play where my role was being slowly written out. The comparisons became more frequent. My mother would mention how David called 3 times this week, or how it's so nice to have family close by. At first, I told myself she was simply sharing her joy in seeing them often, but over time it felt like she was measuring me against them and finding me lacking. I began to notice the absence of questions about my own life, my work, my friends, my plans. When I did share something, the conversation shifted quickly, as though my world existed only at the edges of theirs. Even in moments of success, the distance showed. When my cookbook was published, I sent them an early copy, proud to see my name on the cover, my recipes printed on crisp pages. They displayed it in their living room, but admitted they hadn't tried any of the dishes. "The photographs are lovely," my mother said, as if I had simply posed for them rather than crafted every detail over months of testing and refinement. It was meant to be a compliment, but it stung. The more I built my own life in Vermont, the more the space between us seemed to grow. My home, my work, my friendships, all of it was real and vibrant to me, but invisible in their version of our family. The center of gravity in our gatherings had shifted, and I was no longer standing in it. There were moments when I tried to bridge the gap. I invited them to visit the farmhouse, offering weekends where I could cook for them, show them the orchard, introduce them to the quiet beauty of the place I had chosen. The invitations were always met with vague promises or logistical excuses. "It's such a long drive," my mother would say, though I had made the same drive dozens of times without complaint. They were willing to accept my effort to come to them, but not to extend their own toward me. It was in these small refusals, repeated over months, that I began to feel the slow erosion of our closeness. I still told myself it was temporary, that a holiday or shared moment could pull us back together. I clung to Thanksgiving as proof that no matter how far I moved, we would always find each other at that table. The thought that they could one day choose to remove me from it felt impossible. But looking back now, I can see how the pieces were already in motion. The unspoken hierarchy had always been there. David as the son who stayed close, me as the daughter who went away. The narrative was easier for them when I was present, but deferential, contributing without asking for space of my own. The moment my life began to stand apart, I was no longer fitting the version of me they knew how to love. The knowledge didn't come all at once. It settled slowly, like dust in a room you thought was clean. At first, it only made the air a little heavier, but with each visit, each phone call, each carefully avoided question about my life, it became harder to ignore. The warmth I had once felt without question now had to be searched for, coaxed out, held tightly before it slipped away again. By the time the message about needing space arrived, I realize now, the space had already been there for a long time. It had been growing in the pauses between words, in the way my chair at the table no longer felt entirely mine. The text wasn't the beginning. It was simply the moment they said aloud what their actions had been telling me for years. And as painful as it was also clarifying, because if they could rewrite the rules of our togetherness without warning, then maybe I could rewrite my own. The morning the truth settled in, the sky over the orchard was pale and still. It was early November, the kind of day when the air holds the faint metallic edge of winter, but the light still feels like autumn. I had been in the kitchen, slicing apples for a pie, the rhythmic work keeping my thoughts quiet. My phone was on the counter, face down, vibrating once, then again. I wiped my hands and turned it over without much urgency, expecting a delivery notification or a friend checking in. Instead, I saw my mother's name and a preview of a message that stopped me mid-breath. They thought it would be best if I skipped Thanksgiving this year. They needed some space. It would be a smaller gathering. I read the words twice before opening the full message. My eyes traced them again, trying to fit them into some narrative that didn't hurt. I imagined they were ill, or maybe planning a trip. But the phrases were deliberate, polished, too careful to be casual. My fingers hovered over the phone before I set it down on the counter, the knife beside it catching the light. In that moment, my mind began building explanations like scaffolding, shaky but quick. Perhaps they wanted to avoid the long drive for me. Perhaps they thought I would appreciate a quieter holiday after a busy season. But beneath those polite guesses, something colder was taking shape. A truth that pressed at the edges until I couldn't keep it out. I called them because I needed to hear their voices to believe the message. The line clicked, and my mother's voice came through bright, almost overly so, as if she were already bracing for my reaction. She said they were doing something simpler this year. Smaller. Intimate. I pictured their dining room, the long table with the heavy runner, the polished silver, the chairs filled by the same people every year. I asked who would be there for this smaller gathering. There was the slightest pause, so thin it could be missed if you weren't listening for it. Then she listed them. My brother David, his wife Pamela, and their young son. Pamela was expecting again and feeling unwell, she explained, so they thought a quiet family dinner would be best. There it was, the word family, used like a locked door. They were all still invited. I was the only one told to stay away. The scaffolding of explanations in my head collapsed in a single soundless fall. This wasn't about sparing me a long drive. It wasn't about simplifying. It was about having the holiday without me. In that instant, I felt myself step out of the frame of our family portrait. I could see them arranging themselves at the table as if I had never been there at all. My chair would be pulled out for someone else. Or maybe not at all. The empty space a quiet relief to them. I ended the call with polite words I didn't mean, promising to think about it, though there was nothing to decide. The decision had already been made, and it was not mine. The silence in my kitchen afterward was heavy, as if the house itself had taken a breath and was holding it. I sat on the floor, my back against the cabinet, and let the weight of it press down. Years of loyalty, of careful attention, of bending my life around their needs, seemed to unravel in an instant. I thought of every long drive home, every night I stayed up preparing dishes to please them, every moment I smiled through criticism to keep the peace. None of it had shielded me from this. I cycled through the emotions as if they were stations on a familiar dial. Hurt, confusion, anger, bargaining. I wondered if I had done something recently to cause this, if I had been more absent than I realized. I told myself I could call them back and offer to cook the entire meal to make it easier. I could rearrange my schedule, visit more often. But each version of that thought dissolved quickly, leaving me with the same truth. I was being excluded, and nothing I offered now would change that. The realization was like a cold wind in the chest. It stripped away the last illusions I had about my place at that table. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a choice. I stood and moved through the kitchen slowly, touching the counters, the sink, the heavy wood of the farm table I had dreamed of filling with family. I had imagined them here, imagined the warmth of bringing our tradition into this space. Now I pictured it empty, and the emptiness was not my doing. That day, something in me shifted. If they could decide so easily that my presence wasn't necessary, then I could decide too. I could decide that my belonging didn't hinge on being granted a seat at their table. I could decide that my home could hold its own traditions, its own warmth, without their permission. But before any of that, I let myself feel the full depth of what had been taken from me. The sense of continuity I had carried for my entire life, that no matter what changed, we would always gather for Thanksgiving, was gone. And it wasn't a slow fade. It was cut clean, in a handful of words sent through a screen. By nightfall, the house was quiet again. The pie I'd been making sat unfinished, the apples browning on the counter. I left them there, letting them soften into something unrecognizable, the way the day had done. I knew I wouldn't be able to go back to the version of myself who believed that showing up was enough to guarantee a place. The truth was simple now. If I wanted a seat at a table, I would have to set it myself. In the days that followed, the message replayed in my head on a loop. It would arrive uninvited, just as I was chopping vegetables or folding laundry, and I'd hear the careful politeness of it again. We think it would be best if you skip Thanksgiving this year. We need some space. The words were clean, deliberate, and yet they trailed behind them 1,000 unspoken things. I found myself wondering, obsessively at times, about the shape the evening would take without me. I could see the table in my parents' dining room as clearly as if I were standing in it. The gold-trimmed plates, the polished silver, the heavy runner that only appeared for holidays. My chair was always on the left side, midway down, close enough to the kitchen to help without being in the way. That chair had been mine for as long as I could remember, and now I couldn't stop picturing someone else in it. At first, the thought was vague, just a shadowy outline of a person who didn't belong there. But as I went about my days, the outline began to fill. The first clue came in the form of a social media post I stumbled upon without meaning to see it. A distant cousin had shared a photo from a pre-holiday dinner at my parents' house. It was nothing remarkable at first glance. A few people seated at the kitchen island, glasses of wine in hand. But in the corner of the photo, leaning casually against the counter, was a face I recognized instantly: my former best friend. The sight of her in my parents' home sent a quick, electric jolt through me. We hadn't spoken in years, not since the rupture that ended our friendship. The betrayal had been sharp and personal, something I never imagined could be forgiven, much less forgotten. And yet, there she was, smiling in my parents' kitchen as if she had always belonged there. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe she'd run into them somewhere. Maybe it was a random visit. But my mind began weaving the possibilities together, each one tightening the knot in my stomach. The timing was too close to be coincidence. As the days passed, more pieces surfaced. A neighbor of my parents mentioned in passing that they had seen a young woman visiting them frequently lately, someone new at Sunday dinners. They didn't know her name, but the way they described her, tall, dark hair, quick to laugh, was unmistakable. It was like finding a thread in a sweater and knowing, with one pull, the whole thing would come undone. I began replaying old memories of her in my mind, the way she had once fit so seamlessly into my family's gatherings, how my mother had liked her immediately, maybe even more than she liked me sometimes. I remembered the subtle ways she could charm a room, how easily she took up space without seeming to. And I thought about the final fracture between us, the thing I'd sworn I would never forgive. The idea that she could be sitting in my chair, carving the turkey with my father, laughing with my brother, was more than just a sting. It felt like a deliberate replacement. I couldn't decide which hurt more: the thought that my parents might not see the cruelty of it, or the possibility that they did see it and chose it anyway. For a while, the hurt left me paralyzed. I went through the motions of work, cooked dinners for one, and moved through my days as if walking underwater. But slowly, something else began to take hold. It was a quiet, steady determination, building in the space where grief had been. If they didn't want me at their table, then I would set my own. The thought came in pieces, tentative at first. I imagined inviting a few friends who might be without plans, cooking something small, keeping the day light and easy. But as the idea settled, it began to grow roots. I thought about the space in my dining room, the farm table waiting for purpose, the way light fell across it in the early afternoon. I thought about how much joy I found in feeding people who appreciated it, people who didn't measure the food against old recipes or nitpick the seasoning. The more I pictured it, the more I realized I could create something entirely mine. A gathering that didn't carry the weight of comparison, where every guest came because they wanted to be there, not because obligation pulled them in. The decision didn't erase the hurt, but it gave me something to reach for. It was a way to reclaim the holiday, to remind myself that I could still belong somewhere, even if that somewhere wasn't at my parents' table. I began making a mental list of people to invite. Friends from nearby towns, colleagues who might have the day off. My neighbor, Frank, who had once mentioned he didn't have much family nearby. The names added up quickly, and with each one, the day began to take on shape. I didn't tell my parents, and I didn't plan to. This wasn't about making a statement or proving a point. At least, that's what I told myself. Deep down, I knew there was a part of me that wanted them to see what I could create without them. Not to hurt them, but to remind them, and maybe remind myself, that I wasn't defined by their approval. Still, the thought of her in my chair lingered. It came to me late at night, in the stillness before sleep, and in the quiet moments when I was alone in the kitchen. It was an image I couldn't shake, her laughing at some story, my mother nodding in delight, the family photo taken at the end of the night with her standing where I used to stand. But now, alongside that image, there was another. A table in my own home, filled with people I chose, people who chose me. Glasses raised, candles burning low, the sound of laughter spilling into the night. My chair, my table, my rules. And for the first time since the message had arrived, that image felt stronger than the shadow in theirs. The morning the decision solidified, frost clung to the edges of the orchard like delicate lace. The farmhouse was still, the quiet kind that makes you hear your own breathing. I stood in the kitchen with a mug of coffee warming my hands, staring at the empty stretch of my dining table. The long, weathered wood seemed to look back at me, waiting for purpose. I had been turning the idea over in my mind for days, the thought of hosting my own gathering. At first, it was just a quiet fantasy, a way to dull the sting of being uninvited. But that morning, as pale light spilled across the floor, I knew I was going to do it. Not think about it. Not consider it. Do it. The decision felt both exhilarating and terrifying. I had never hosted a holiday entirely on my own before. At my parents' house, I'd been the one in the kitchen, yes, but the walls, the rituals, the guest list, they were never mine. Here, everything would be shaped by my choices. Every detail would carry my imprint. I pulled a notepad toward me and began to write. First, the guest list. My pen moved quickly, the names arriving without hesitation. Sarah, my closest friend, who had always been a steady presence. Miguel, my sous chef from years back, who had just moved to Burlington. Jasmine and Tyler, the couple from the farmer's market who brought wine and easy conversation. Frank, my elderly neighbor who once told me he dreaded the holidays alone. Colleagues from the consulting work I'd taken on in New Hampshire, people who understood the rhythm of a busy kitchen. By the time I put the pen down, there were 15 names. A solid start, I thought. Enough to make the table feel alive, but not so many that it would spiral out of control. Next came the menu. My mind leapt to the flavors I wanted to serve. A heritage turkey brined in cider and herbs, roasted root vegetables glazed with maple from a local farm, stuffing studded with foraged mushrooms and crumbled sausage, Parker House rolls made from scratch, and a trio of pies featuring apples from my own orchard. This was my canvas, and I could paint it however I wanted. No debates over whether garlic belonged in the potatoes. No side eyes if the cranberry sauce had a twist of orange zest. I began calling in quiet favors, the kind you can only ask when you've earned them over years of showing up for other people. The vineyard couple offered cases of wine. A food stylist friend said she'd help with the table decor. A colleague promised to bring extra serving platters. Frank said he'd contribute homemade rolls and a story or two for the table. With each yes, the vision grew sharper. I spent the afternoon clearing the dining room, moving stacks of boxes I'd been meaning to unpack since the move. I retrieved the table leaves from the attic, dusting off their edges. The table stretched out to its full length, suddenly looking like it belonged to another time, when families were large and meals lasted for hours. I ran my hands over its surface, imagining where the candles would sit, where the platters would rest, how the light from the windows would catch the glassware in the early afternoon. By evening, I had a plan taped to the refrigerator, a prep schedule spanning the next 10 days, every dish broken down into steps, every ingredient accounted for. It was second nature to me. The discipline of a kitchen, the structure that turns chaos into something seamless. This was where I felt most at home, in the lists, the order, the quiet confidence of knowing I could make it happen. And yet, beneath the steady hum of organization, a thread of something raw remained. Every time I set a place in my mind's eye, I saw the gap at my parents' table. I pictured the scene as I imagined it. My chair filled, my absence unnoticed, laughter spilling over plates I would never see. I could almost hear her voice, my former best friend, sliding easily into the rhythm of the family, offering stories, making herself useful. The image cut deep, but I didn't turn away from it. I let it remind me why I was doing this. I wasn't just making a meal, I was reclaiming something. I was choosing to sit at a table where I belonged, even if I had to build that table myself. In the days that followed, the house transformed. I moved through markets and farm stands, filling baskets with squash, cranberries, fresh cream. I picked apples from my own trees, feeling the weight of them in my hands, the crisp scent rising as I sorted them into baskets. The kitchen counters disappeared under stacks of bowls, measuring cups, and printed recipes in plastic sleeves. The farmhouse, so recently a place of quiet, began to hum with energy. As the guest list grew, friends of friends asking if they could join, neighbors offering to bring side dishes, I realized this was no longer a consolation prize. This was the main event. The center of gravity was shifting, and for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel like the excluded one. I felt like the host. Late one evening, after the last batch of pie dough was wrapped and chilling in the refrigerator, I stood at the kitchen window and looked out over the orchard. The moon hung low, washing the bare branches in silver. My breath fogged the glass as I thought about the approaching day. I didn't know how my parents would react if they found out. I didn't know if they'd care, or if it would sting them the way their message had stung me. But that wasn't the point anymore. The point was that I had a table, and soon it would be full. I turned away from the window, letting the warmth of the kitchen close around me. There was still work to be done, but for the first time since that message had landed, the work felt light. The heaviness that had sat in my chest for days had shifted into momentum, into purpose. This year, I thought, I won't be waiting for someone else to set my place. I'll be setting it myself. By the Tuesday before Thanksgiving, the farmhouse had transformed into a living, breathing kitchen. Counters disappeared under stacks of vegetables, baking trays, and bowls of pie filling cooling on wire racks. The scent of cinnamon and roasting squash hung in the air like a warm blanket, and the steady hum of work kept my thoughts from drifting too far toward the empty place my family had left. Sarah had arrived the night before, suitcase by the door, sleeves rolled up before she even took off her coat. Together, we moved with the unspoken rhythm of people who had cooked side by side many times before. She chopped while I measured. I stirred while she rolled dough. It was a partnership born of trust and timing, and with each passing hour, the menu came closer to reality. Miguel was due to arrive that evening from Burlington, bringing extra equipment and the kind of good-natured chaos only he could provide. Frank had called to confirm he'd be bringing not just his homemade rolls but also black and white photographs from Thanksgivings past. For atmosphere, he'd said in his gravelly voice. Every message, every contribution, added another stitch to the fabric of the day I was creating. I was elbow-deep in a mixing bowl when my phone rang, vibrating against the wood of the counter. The screen lit up with a name I hadn't expected to see, Aunt Catherine, my mother's sister. I hesitated, flour dusting my hands, before wiping them on a towel and answering. Her voice came through warm and familiar, tinged with the kind of affection that makes you straighten your posture without thinking. She asked how I was, her tone careful but curious, and then said she'd spoken to my mother a few days earlier. According to my mother, I had decided not to come to Thanksgiving this year. Too busy with work, apparently. The lie sat there between us for a moment, as heavy as the mixing bowl in my hands. Catherine's pause told me she wasn't buying it, so I told her the truth. I told her about the message, about being asked to stay home so they could have a smaller, more intimate gathering that still included my brother's family. I told her how I'd sat in my kitchen feeling like I'd been erased, how I'd tried to make sense of it, and how eventually I'd decided to host my own gathering instead. There was a soft sigh on the other end of the line. Your mother has always had a controlling streak, she said finally. But this is something else. Her words weren't gossipy or cruel. They were steady, grounded in the kind of clarity that comes from years of watching patterns repeat themselves. And then she said something I didn't expect. She wanted to come to my Friendsgiving. The offer caught me off guard. This wasn't just a casual RSVP. This was a declaration, a line drawn in quiet defiance. It meant choosing my table over my parents', something no one in the family had ever done. I felt an unexpected burn of tears behind my eyes. I asked if she was sure, knowing the ripple it would cause. She laughed softly and told me not to worry. She'd tell my mother she was unwell, something vague but convincing. She never visits the sick, Catherine said wryly, so it won't be questioned. We spoke for a while longer, about the menu, about the guests who would be there, about the table I was setting in the farmhouse. She asked for my address, promising to bring flowers and something stronger for after the meal. When we hung up, I stood for a moment in the middle of the kitchen, phone still in my hand, feeling the shape of the shift that had just occurred. It wasn't just that she was coming. It was that she was choosing me. That choice settled into me like warmth spreading through cold fingers. For weeks, I'd been building this gathering with the knowledge that my family had stepped away from me. Now, someone from within that family was stepping toward me instead. The rest of the day moved with a lighter rhythm. Sarah noticed it before I even said anything. Something's different, she remarked as she arranged pastry rounds on a tray. I told her about Catherine, about the call, and she grinned like she'd been waiting for news exactly like this. See, she said, people know where they want to be. That evening, as Miguel arrived with his boyfriend and an avalanche of cooking gear, the house swelled with noise and motion. The kitchen was crowded but harmonious, everyone falling into tasks as if they'd been rehearsing for weeks. There was music playing, wine being poured, and the steady exchange of stories across the island. For a moment, I stepped back from it all, leaning against the doorframe, watching the room fill itself. The long table in the dining room was ready, candles lined down its center, mismatched chairs pulled from every corner of the house. Even in its unfinished state, it looked alive. In my mind, I contrasted it with the table in my parents' home, polished, perfect, but rigid in its order. Mine was imperfect, its edges softened by use and its chairs uneven, but it was open in a way theirs had never been. Late that night, after everyone had gone to bed or curled up in guest rooms, I found myself in the quiet kitchen again. The counters were cluttered with prep bowls, but I didn't mind. I brewed tea and sat for a while, thinking about Catherine's decision. Her presence would not erase the absence of my parents, but it shifted something inside me. It reminded me that family is not a monolith, that it's made up of individuals with their own choices, loyalties, and boundaries. And it proved that I wasn't imagining the lines that had been drawn around me. Others saw them too. That night, as I climbed the stairs to bed, the house felt different. Not because of the food or the decorations, but because I could feel the gravity of what I was building. A table that people wanted to come to. A space where absence was never engineered, where no one would be quietly replaced. Catherine's chair was already set in my mind, waiting among the others. And for the first time since the message had arrived, I was looking forward to the holiday with more than determination. I was looking forward to it with joy. Thanksgiving morning arrived quietly, the kind of stillness that feels like the world holding its breath. The sky was a pale silver, and frost glittered in the orchard like sugar dusting. I woke before dawn, the farmhouse dark except for the faint glow from the kitchen where I'd left the under-counter light on. For a moment, I stood at the top of the stairs listening to the silence, then descended into the heart of the day I had built. The turkey had been brining for 2 days, and when I lifted it from the cool depths of the stock pot, the air filled with the scent of cider, rosemary, and sage. The kitchen came alive in small increments, the click of the oven preheating, the low thump of a cutting board on the counter, the whisk's rhythm against the sides of a bowl. These were movements I knew by heart, but today they carried a weight and a lightness all at once. By the time Sarah padded into the kitchen, hair tousled, asking where the coffee was, I had already lined the counters with ingredients for every dish. Soon Miguel appeared, cheerful and already pulling pans from the stack he'd brought. Frank arrived just after 9, his arms loaded with a basket of rolls wrapped in linen and a stack of black and white photographs. He placed them on a side table, explaining each one. Frozen moments of mid-century Thanksgivings, tables groaning under the weight of roasted birds, people leaning in close to talk. The house began to swell with voices and warmth as the morning wore on. Jasmine and Tyler arrived with bottles of their vineyard wine, followed by 2 friends they'd brought along, a couple named Henry and Grace, who carried a wild rice dish fragrant with herbs. Guests from my consulting work appeared in waves, some fresh from morning shifts, carrying pies and casseroles still warm. By noon, every corner of the farmhouse hummed with conversation. The dining table was already set, candles lined down the center, their flames flickering in the drafty old room. The chairs didn't match, some borrowed from neighbors, others pulled from my own mismatched collection. It looked exactly as I had imagined, imperfect, inviting, and entirely mine. When Aunt Catherine arrived, her arms were full of flowers and a bottle of bourbon. She embraced me in the doorway, holding me a moment longer than necessary, as if to make sure I understood the weight of her being there. Her presence was a quiet rebellion, but it carried the warmth of solidarity. She wandered into the kitchen, chatting easily with the others, and I watched her settle into the gathering as if she had been part of its design all along. The final rush to the table was a blur of movement and sound. Dishes were carried in from the kitchen, each one set down with the pride of its maker. The turkey rested on its platter, skin burnished and crisp, surrounded by rosemary sprigs. Platters of roasted vegetables caught the candlelight, their maple glaze glistening. Bowls of stuffing, rolls, salads, and sauces crowded the space until there was barely room for the plates. When everything was ready, I rang a small brass bell I'd found at an antique shop. Conversations softened, chairs scraped, and people found their places, some seated, some standing with plates in hand. The room smelled of roasting meat, sweet spices, and something harder to name: the shared hunger for connection. I stood for a moment, taking in the sight. This was not the table I had grown up with, the one where my seat had been pulled away without warning. This was a table I had built from the ground up, piece by piece, invitation by invitation. Before anyone began to eat, I raised my glass. The words came without rehearsal, rising from somewhere deeper than habit. I want to thank you all for being here, I began, my voice catching slightly. A month ago, I thought I'd be spending this holiday in a different place, following traditions that no longer felt like mine. Instead, I'm standing here, surrounded by people who came because they chose to. This table, this day, is exactly what I needed, even before I knew I needed it. So, here's to chosen family, the people who show up, who make space, and who remind us that belonging isn't given, it's made. Glasses lifted, the words echoed back to me in a chorus. To chosen family. The meal began, plates passed hand to hand, each person serving the next. Laughter rose in waves, spilling over the edges of the room. Conversations crisscrossed the table, Miguel telling stories from the restaurant world, Frank recounting his first Thanksgiving with his late wife, Catherine reminiscing about the times she and my mother would sneak extra dessert as children. Between bites, I moved through the room, refilling glasses, making sure no one's plate stayed empty for long. I caught snippets of connection blooming between guests who had never met before, a shared interest in gardening, a mutual love of obscure cookbooks, an impromptu plan to visit the vineyard together in the spring. There were no tense pauses, no careful sidestepping of topics, no undercurrent of comparison. Just the hum of people enjoying each other's company, the kind of sound that seeps into your bones and lingers. As the meal wound down, dessert plates replaced dinner ones, the table now scattered with crumbs and wine rings. Pies were sliced, whipped cream passed around, coffee brewed. Some guests drifted into the living room, others stayed at the table, talking long after their plates were clean. At one point, I stepped back into the kitchen alone, leaning against the counter for a moment to breathe it in, the full weight of the day. Outside, the light was fading into that particular November dusk, but inside, the house was bright with warmth and motion. I realized then that I hadn't thought about my parents' table once since the guests arrived. I hadn't wondered who was sitting in my chair or how they were spending the day. I was too busy living in this one, at my own table, in my own home, surrounded by people who made the air feel light. Later, when someone suggested a group photo, we crammed onto the farmhouse porch, cheeks flushed from wine and laughter, arms around each other. The camera clicked, capturing a moment that would never be exactly the same again, but would always live in the frame of memory. Looking at all of them, I understood something I hadn't before. I hadn't just replaced what I'd lost. I had built something entirely new, and in that creation, I had found myself again. The morning after Friendsgiving, the farmhouse was quiet in the way a home can only be after a night of celebration. The scent of roasted turkey and maple still lingered in the air, mingling with the faint smokiness from the fire we'd lit in the living room. The dining table was a beautiful kind of wreck, candle stubs leaning in pools of wax, empty glasses smudged with fingerprints, plates stacked at odd angles. Friends had stayed overnight, tucked into guest rooms, curled on couches, sprawled on air mattresses. I moved through the kitchen in my slippers, gathering mugs and starting a pot of coffee. My body was tired, but it was the good kind of tired, the kind that follows a day spent doing exactly what you were meant to do. I was cracking eggs into a skillet when Sarah wandered in, hair tousled, wearing one of my oversized sweaters. She smiled, murmured a good morning, and began toasting bread. Slowly, others drifted in, drawn by the smell of breakfast. Soon, we were all crowded around the island, eating turkey hash made from the leftovers, laughing at our favorite moments from the night before. It wasn't until after breakfast, when the guests began gathering their things to leave, that I picked up my phone for the first time in nearly 24 hours. The screen lit up with a flood of notifications, 37 text messages, 12 missed calls, and more social media alerts than I could count. At first, I thought it might just be friends posting about the dinner. The early messages were exactly that. Warm compliments, photos tagged from the night before, little notes saying how much fun they'd had. But as I scrolled further, the tone shifted. a text from my brother stood out. "Mom is having a meltdown about your Thanksgiving party. Call her as soon as possible." The next messages were from my mother. They began polite but quickly escalated. "We need to talk. Call me immediately." Then, "How could you do this to us?" And finally, "You have embarrassed us in front of everyone." I set the phone down on the counter, my appetite gone. Around me, the kitchen noise faded as Sarah noticed my expression. "They know," I said simply. It didn't take long to figure out how. Jasmine had posted the group photo from last night, the one with all of us crammed onto the porch. I'd been tagged in it. Buried in the comments was one from my 6-year-old nephew. "Is that Aunt Abby?" My brother must have seen it. From there, it wouldn't have taken long for my parents to piece it together. The phone began to ring again, my mother's ringtone cutting through the air. Everyone in the kitchen looked at me. Sarah's voice was gentle but firm. "You don't have to answer that right now." But I knew I would. I'd been avoiding this confrontation my entire life, and now it was here. I swiped to answer and put it on speaker, because if I was going to stand my ground, I wanted witnesses. Her voice was tight from the start, each word sharpened. She accused me of deception, of intentionally hiding the event from them to make them look bad. She said their friends were calling, asking why they hadn't been at my lavish dinner. She claimed I'd embarrassed the family, that I'd been ungrateful, that I'd turned my back on them. I listened, letting the words wash over me, feeling the familiar pressure to smooth things over rise like a tide. But this time, I didn't reach for it. When she paused, I spoke clearly. I reminded her of her own words, that they wanted space, that they were planning a smaller gathering without me. I told her I had respected that, and that I had chosen to make my own plans rather than sit alone on a holiday. I told her it wasn't meant to embarrass anyone. She didn't hear me. She pushed on, twisting my decision into an attack. My father joined in, his voice cool and disappointed, saying I should have invited them anyway, that I'd been deceitful for not telling them. The logic stunned me. They had uninvited me, but were now upset I hadn't invited them in return. Something in me, long dormant, snapped into place. I told them plainly that I was done apologizing for existing outside of their expectations, that I would no longer twist myself into the shape they wanted just to keep my seat at their table. There was a long silence. Then my father said coldly, "Perhaps we do need space." "Perhaps we do," I replied. I ended the call, my hand steady on the phone. The kitchen was silent for a beat before Sarah reached across the counter and squeezed my hand. "I'm proud of you," she said. The others nodded, their quiet presence like a wall of support at my back. That wasn't the last confrontation. My brother called later, not to defend me but to scold me for making things harder for our parents. He said I should have just let it go for 1 year. I asked why he hadn't spoken up when I was excluded. His silence told me everything I needed to know. In the days that followed, the messages from my parents shifted tone. First anger, then guilt, then attempts to downplay the entire situation. I answered each one briefly, calmly, without letting the hooks of blame sink in. It was exhausting, but also liberating. For the first time, I was speaking to them from a place that didn't rely on their approval. What surprised me most was the ripple effect. Extended family members began reaching out, aunts, uncles, even some of my parents' friends, to tell me they'd heard what happened and that they supported me. Some admitted they'd seen the favoritism for years, that they admired me for finally standing up to it. Each message was a small weight lifting off my chest. The story I'd been told all my life, that I was the difficult one, the ungrateful one, was beginning to unravel. And in its place, a different truth was taking shape. The truth that I wasn't wrong to set my own table. The truth that belonging is never a favor someone gives you. It's something you claim. After the call with my parents, the house felt impossibly quiet. Friends trickled out over the next day, their cars pulling away down the long gravel drive, each goodbye leaving a little more stillness behind. When the last door closed, I walked through my farmhouse alone, taking in the aftermath of Friendsgiving, the empty bottles lined like trophies, the wax puddles from candles that had burned low, the faint scent of herbs still clinging to the air. There was peace in it, but also weight. The holiday was over, but the tension with my parents hung in the air like smoke. For the first time in my life, I wasn't filling the silence between us with immediate apologies or calls to smooth things over. I was letting the quiet stay. Still, I won't pretend it was easy. Years of habit don't break overnight. There were moments in the days after when I almost picked up the phone to bridge the gap, moments when the good daughter instinct kicked in, urging me to undo the damage at any cost. But something in me knew that if I patched this over without addressing the deeper wound, I'd be back in the same place by next Thanksgiving. That's when I decided to find a therapist. I wanted someone outside the family, someone with no history or bias, to help me untangle the knots I'd carried for decades. I found Dr. Janine Moore, a woman with kind eyes and a knack for listening without flinching at the mess. In our second session, after I laid out the Thanksgiving story from start to finish, she leaned forward slightly. "It sounds like you've played a very specific role in your family for a long time," she said. "The dependable one, the peacekeeper, the person who doesn't make waves. When you moved away and built more independence, you disrupted that system. Excluding you from Thanksgiving may have been a way to pull you back in line." Her words landed hard because they rang true. I'd felt the shift ever since buying the farmhouse, ever since putting more space between my life and theirs. They had responded not with curiosity, but with control. "So it was never really about a smaller gathering," I said slowly. "Probably not," she replied. "The question now is, how do you want this relationship to look going forward? Because you can't change their behavior. You can only decide your boundaries and hold to them." I left that session feeling clearer, if not lighter. I couldn't force them to see me differently, but I could refuse to shrink to fit their expectations. 2 weeks before Christmas, a letter arrived in the mail. It was from my father, handwritten on his personal stationery. That alone was unusual. Most of our communication had been through my mother or quick phone calls. The letter wasn't an apology exactly, but it was softer than anything I'd received from him in months. He acknowledged that asking me to skip Thanksgiving had hurt me, even if that wasn't their intention. He said he missed our Sunday calls. He suggested meeting for coffee when I was next in Connecticut. It was enough to open a door. I called him and we arranged to meet halfway, in a small cafe on neutral ground. The conversation was careful, full of pauses and unsaid things, but he admitted something that caught me off guard. "You were always so reliable, Abby. I suppose we came to expect that you'd accommodate whatever we needed." "That doesn't make it right," I told him. "No," he said after a long pause. "I suppose it doesn't." Progress with my mother was slower. When she finally called, she acted as though nothing had happened, filling the air with neighborhood gossip and updates about David's kids. But when I brought up Thanksgiving gently, she went quiet. "I don't see why we're still talking about this," she said at first. But over the course of a few more conversations, she admitted something unexpected. My move to Vermont had left her feeling left out. "You've built this whole life without us," she said. Sometimes I look at it and feel jealous. It was strange, hearing that from the woman I'd always thought of as unshakable. I told her I'd never seen it as leaving her behind, only as building something for myself. It didn't fix everything, but it shifted the ground between us. By Christmas Eve, we'd reached a tentative truce. They hosted as usual, with David's family there, and I brought desserts. On Christmas Day, they drove up to Vermont to see the farmhouse for the first time. Watching them step into my space, My kitchen, my orchard, my living room felt like a small victory. They were guests in my world now, and I think they could feel the difference. Over dinner, my mother surprised me by raising her glass. "To new traditions," she said, meeting my eyes, "and to a daughter who has the courage to create her own path." The months after that were a slow rebuilding. We still had flare-ups. Old patterns didn't disappear, but there was more awareness on both sides. By the time the next November rolled around, I was the one who started the conversation about Thanksgiving. "What if we alternate?" I suggested. "One year at your place, one year at mine, and everyone's included." She agreed without hesitation. "And I promise not to criticize your garlic levels," she teased. "And I promise not to post photos that make you look bad," I said, smiling. That year, we all gathered at their house, my parents, my brother's family, Aunt Catherine, even Sarah, who had become a fixture in my life. The following year, they came to my farmhouse, sitting at the same long table that had once been filled only with friends. Looking around that night, I realized the lesson wasn't about choosing between my family of origin and my chosen family. It was about making space for both, on terms that honored my needs as well as theirs. Sometimes the tables we build aren't replacements, they're extensions. And sometimes the most painful rejections are the very moments that teach us how to build them.